So in this video, we're going to discuss what it means when people say the securitization of migration. Contemporary migration policies in Europe and around the world are a question of life and death for displaced peoples. Europe's external borders have become the deadliest in the world, as countless try each year to reach Fortress Europe. But bubbling beneath the surface of Europe's strategy of deterrence, externalized control, and securitized migration, there's a contradiction. Europe's aging population and plummeting birth rate means that approximately 18 million migrants will be needed over the next 10 years to maintain social welfare contributions. With the exception of the Ukrainian displacement, the vast majority of people trying to enter Europe are people of color. And scholars have argued that racialization remains a key nexus to understanding contemporary migration. Post-Cold War Islamophobia and historic Oriental legacies manifest as Muslim caricatures. Men are painted as a menace, violent and irrational, while women are oppressed. So what is the securitization of migration? Well, academics have widely discussed the links between migration and security in what is known as the securitization of migration. The scholarship on securitization was developed first by the so-called Copenhagen School to conceive of security threats as socially constructed through a process of securitization. This can take place discursively through speech acts, and that by labeling migrants as a security threat, the words themselves imply an extraordinary response to the presence of migrants. This idea of speech acts is kind of similar to the theory of performativity, which was first conceptualized by a man named Austin in 1975. He described it as a particular type of utterance that does what it says. So the issuing of the utterance is the performing of an action, like particularly in relation to marriage. I now pronounce you man and wife, but it's the words themselves that perform the action itself. Then in the 1990s, in 1993, Judith Butler applied the concept of performativity to gender. And she argued that formativity must be understood not as a singular or deliberate act, but rather as the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names. So how gender, how discourse upon gender actually plays a performative role in producing the gender, male and female. And however, conversely, an academic named Sara Ahmed inverted this concept to explain what she terms non-performative, which basically the non-performative is a speech acts which are effective precisely because the words fail to bring about what they name. So she used this concept in relation to anti-racism policies in academia. And she argued that when an institution says it's going to take anti-racism actions, that is a way to actually not tackle racist actions, if you see what I mean. By saying that they are implementing anti-racist policies within their institution, such as in higher education or within any institution, is actually a way that the institution gets away with not doing anything at all, because they've just said it, and so it becomes non-performative. So by saying it, it does not produce the effect that it says. I hope that that's clear. I know it's a little bit of a double contradiction. However, other scholars have argued that securitization does not only take place discursively, but also symbolically, such as through the spectacle of the border, which is a concept that was coined by de Genova. He wrote quite a difficult article about it, which I may discuss in another video because it's such an important point, but the way that he writes is so cryptic, it can be really difficult to understand. And other scholars argue that, the proliferation of EU agencies, increased militarization, and the expansion of Frontex are also ways in which migration becomes securitized. But ultimately, by saying that migration is a securitization problem, it becomes a securitization problem. When actually, in reality, migration is just a human phenomenon that has gone on since the beginning of humankind. And it is not a security risk. It's a human situation which requires human responses. It does not require securitization. That's my ultimate argument throughout this video, and hopefully you will see why by the end of it. Another academic called Vigo, draws attention to the correlation between securitization of migration through political discourse, as well as a range of administrative practices such as population profiling and risk assessment. So further literature has highlighted the role of EU databases, for example, in the surveillance of irregular migrants and the importance of the digital borders. If you know, there's a kind of a proliferation of EU databases with a lot of biodata of all migrants, including those who arrive through regular and irregular means. And certain authors, such as Broders, argues that this is indicative of the surveillance of both irregular and regular migrants, and the digital border has an important consequence on the effects of securitizing migration. And basically, overall, all of these different kinds of management techniques, even though they may appear to be less violent, it's like data control, visa control, online control, rather than the guard with his gun. Ultimately, the argument of certain authors is that these management techniques, are no less violent than those enacted by the border guards with their guns. Joseph Carent, he wrote a really famous article which was called Aliens and Citizens, The Case for Open Borders. And the first line in his article is basically he writes this whole piece which is all about him trying to prove that from the liberal tradition, because in the West, right, we live in what they call a liberal democracy. It's the particular type of democracy that we live in. It's liberal, and I don't mean like to the left liberal, I mean neoliberal. And so he basically goes against this liberal tradition, tries to prove that all three of the main types of liberalism, it is not possible to securitize migration. And his first sentence in this article is very famously, borders have guns and guns have guards. It's also the first line in the book by Jansen, Celia, Katz and Lewis. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they wrote a really influential book, which was called The Irregularization of Migration in Contemporary Europe, Detention, Deportation and Drowning, which I really recommend reading if you are interested in this. So basically, authors argue that increased militarized migration and increasing securitization of the border constitutes in itself a source of insecurity and is a questionable security apparatus, particularly because the vast majority of undocumented people in Europe are overstayers and they have arrived through legal channels. So what's going on here? Like, if human migration is a human phenomenon and not a security issue, and the vast majority of people who are irregularly in Europe or the UK are visa overstayers and they arrived with a visa, like on an airplane or whatever, then why is there such massive attention to these small amounts of people who arrive by boats, for example? That's a good question. It's a very good question, but I had a professor when I was at university, and she told us she taught us that these kinds of what they call control dilemmas. Basically, it's like, when we look at a migration policy, it appears to be irrational. Like, it's not driven by facts. It's not driven by data. It's not driven by research. It's not driven by science. It's driven by irrational human emotion, which is appropriated or misappropriated by political agents for their own political purposes, i.e. keeping themselves in positions of power and keeping us, the majority, distracted. That's very key. So yes, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Giadron and Yok, I personally don't like and disagree with, but they highlighted this apparent irrationality of border politics, which they argue stem from these control dilemmas, where basically liberal democratic states must try and balance the interests between law, the liberal norms, political interests, such as populist and anti-immigrant rhetoric, and economic interests, so mobile capital, free trade, the labour market, the demands of the labour market, right? And also the shifting aging population, as I said at the beginning. So they attest that conceptualizing immigration policy in terms of these control dilemmas allows us to better understand its multifaceted and often conflicting goals. So they argue that this can result in policy outcomes that may be intended or otherwise. So scholars claim that in response to the kinds of legal and political constraints, because we have the Geneva Convention, right, and we have a bunch of national, international, and EU, if you're an EU country, EU laws that protect the rights of our citizens and also the rights of man. So basically, what is the securitization of migration? The securitization of migration is a process by which agents and actors produce migration as a security risk, which therefore requires these kinds of extraordinary measures, such as building walls, building walls, turning boats around at sea, preventing life-saving assistance. So one of the most effective ways to manage migration in contemporary Europe and in the world is through the visa. Okay, so this is a kind of remote control, which was first coined by Zollberg, I believe. And this just refers to the necessity in order to obtain a visa before being able to legally enter a territory. And this amounts to the protection of the country of destination's borders into the world at large. So Europe's borders, so the whole concept of borders is such an interesting one, and it's very much linked to securitizing migration, because how is migration securitized? Well, through the border. But the border no longer becomes this like line on a map. The border is projected outside of the country, outside of the actual national borders of the country, into neighbouring countries. So, for example, if we take the case of the UK borders, like if you were to enter the UK on the Eurostar, the UK's borders are actually in France or in Belgium, and you technically cross that border when you go through security and you have your passport checked. So that is a way in which the UK has projected its external borders outside the actual border of its country. The EU does the same, other countries as well, they do the same. You have to apply for a visa from your country, for the most part from your country of origin, in order to get into the country. The only exception in which this does not apply is, other than like visa-free travel, the exception to the visa rule, of course, is asylum, because it's not possible at the moment to apply for asylum from your country, either your country of origin or perhaps, if you were displaced from your country and you entered a second country, you're unable to apply for asylum or an asylum visa because it doesn't exist. The only way that you can apply for asylum is by entering the territories, for example, entering the EU, entering the UK, and then claiming asylum, which is, of course, a ridiculous catch-22, because it means that people are obliged to take irregular migrational routes in order to arrive in Europe and the UK, in order for their claim to asylum to then be able to be processed. So basically, the EU and the UK has created an asylum law, a whole elaborate system of rights and regulations, which people who have been forcibly displaced from their country of origin for a variety of reasons are unable to access. They have literally created a smuggling market. Irrational. This is one of the key points of this video, is that migration policy is not always about being rational. So just to summarize, what is the securitization of migration? Well, basically migration is not a security threat, and it does not require guns and guards and hyper-securitization and hyper-surveillance. It is a human phenomenon which requires human responses, which requires a coordinated international response to displacement. People who flee their country of origin or who are forcibly displaced for a variety of reasons, including poverty, are not a security risk. They do not present a security threat. Full stop. That's just it. I hope this video was a little bit helpful and it gave you a few different ideas. It gave you a few different references, like if you had to write an article about the securitization of migration, or if you needed to have some other ideas to look into this a little bit further. So thank you very much if you made it to the end of this video, and have a lovely day.